There is a kind of forest that does not want you in it. Not all forests are like this. Most woods are just woods. Trees and birdsong and dappled light falling through the leaves, places you can walk through on a Sunday afternoon and come out the other side a little calmer than you went in. Friendly places. Tame places. But there are older forests, deeper ones, that have stood since long, long before anyone ever thought to give them a name, and these forests have a different feeling to them entirely. You notice it the very moment you step in under the canopy. The light changes, goes green and dim and strange. The sound changes, the ordinary noise of the world falling away behind you until there is only the hush of the deep woods. The air itself goes still, and watchful, and cool. And some part of you, some old animal part buried deep down beneath all your modern thoughts, the part that has never once forgotten what the dark used to mean to your ancestors, that part quietly, urgently suggests that you should not stay here too long. That you should not wander too far from the path. That you are not, perhaps, entirely welcome in this place. The deep woods of Oregon are forests like that. Out past the last paved road, past the last bar of cell signal, past the last lonely farmhouse with its porch light burning against the dark, the land of the Pacific Northwest rises up and up into mile after mile after mile after mile of dense, ancient, primeval forest. Douglas fir and western hemlock and red cedar, grown so tall and so close together over the long slow centuries that their canopy seals over the sky like a green roof, and beneath them the ground is soft and deep with 1,000 years of fallen needles, and the ferns grow up to your waist, and the moss hangs from the branches in long gray curtains, and the fog moves slow between the great trunks like something patient and alive. It is some of the most beautiful country anywhere on this whole earth. I want you to understand that. It is also some of the loneliest, and the oldest, and the least known. People go into those woods all the time. Hikers and hunters and loggers and mushroom pickers and folks just looking for a little peace and quiet away from the noise of the world. And the vast, vast majority of them come back out again with nothing stranger to report than sore feet and wet socks and a head full of good clean memories. But not all of them. And tonight, as the rain comes softly down outside, I want to tell you about 7 who went into the Oregon deep woods, and found that the trees were keeping something. 7 quiet, strange, unsettling stories, told slow and low, with the rain falling all the way through them, the way it falls out there in those forests 3 seasons out of every 4, soft and gray and endless on a billion leaves. There is nothing in any of them that will make you jump. Nothing that leaps out of the dark. There is only the deep green dread of being very far from any other living soul, in a place far older and far stranger than yourself, as the daylight fails and the fog comes up and the rain begins to fall. The perfect thing, I have always found, to turn slowly over in your mind as you sink gently down toward sleep, warm and dry and perfectly safe in your bed, with all those dark wet whispering miles of forest somewhere very far away. So settle in. Pull the blankets close up around you. Let the rain do its slow and gentle work against the window. And if you happen to drift off somewhere out there among the great trees, before a story has reached its end, that is perfectly all right. You needn't fight it. The forest will still be there. It is patient, the forest. It has always been patient. It will keep on going without you, just as it always has, all through the long ages before you were ever born, and all through the long ages still to come, long, long after. Let's begin. Story 1. We'll begin with a man who believed, with good reason, that he knew his woods. A hunter, who had walked the same patch of Oregon forest every single autumn for 35 years, who knew every ridge and creek and game trail in it the way you know the rooms of your own home in the dark. And who, one wet October, found a thing standing in those familiar woods that should not have been there at all. A thing that had not been there the year before. A thing that, he came to understand, had been waiting for him. I have hunted the same stretch of country up in the Oregon Cascades since I was a young man, and I am not a young man anymore, not by a long way, so that is the better part of 35 years walking the same patch of woods, season after season after season. And I want you to truly understand what that means, because it sits at the very heart of this story. When you hunt one single piece of country for that long, you do not merely know it. You know it the way you know your own body. I could have told you, with my eyes shut, where every spring rose up cold out of the hillside, where the elk crossed over the high ridge in the blue light before dawn, which of the great fallen logs you could safely walk across to get over the creek and which ones had gone soft and rotten inside and would dump you straight into the cold water. I knew the big old fire-blackened snag standing dead on the north ridge that the pileated woodpeckers loved to hammer at. I knew the dense patch of devil's club down in the bottom of the draw that you had to swing wide around or pay for it with torn-up hands. 35 years. That forest and I were the oldest of friends. There was nothing left in it, I believed, that could possibly surprise me. That was my mistake. That is always the mistake, isn't it? To believe you know a thing completely. To believe you have seen all that it has to show you. It was October, the very start of the season, and it had been raining for the better part of a week, the steady, soft, patient Oregon rain that simply settles in over the mountains and does not leave, dripping endlessly off the firs, swelling the creeks, turning every trail to dark slick mud. I did not mind it in the least. The rain quiets the whole forest, dampens the sound of your own footsteps so the game can't hear you coming, washes your scent down into the ground, and it gets the elk up and moving. I had hiked in long before first light, a good couple of miles back into the country to a spot I had always favored, high up on the north ridge, and I had settled myself in with my back against that big old burned snag to wait for the light to come up, the rain pattering soft and steady on the hood of my oilskin, the woods around me slowly turning from solid black to dim gray to deep wet green as the dawn came on. And as that light came up, I saw that something in my woods was different. Down the ridge away, perhaps 60 or 70 yards off through the trees, in a little natural clearing that I knew as well as my own backyard, a clearing where I had sat and eaten my lunch 100 times over the years, there was now a structure. I do not have a better word for it than that. A structure. It had not been there the autumn before. I would have staked my life on it. It was a kind of lean-to, or a shelter, or a den, built up out of branches and whole logs, leaned and woven together against the trunk of one of the big old cedars. But it was built wrong. That is the thing I keep coming back to, all these years later, in the quiet. It was not built the way a person builds a shelter. The branches were too big. Some of them were not branches at all but whole young trees, snapped off and dragged into place and leaned up against the cedar in a way that I, a grown man in good condition, could not possibly have managed on my own, not with a rope and a winch. And they were arranged in a pattern that made no earthly sense to me. No sense for keeping the rain off. No sense for holding in warmth. Just a dense, deliberate, woven cone of heavy green timber that must have taken enormous strength, and a great deal of patient time, to build. And it was not new. It was weathered, gray, settled. It had been standing there in the rain for a good while. Now, my very first thought, naturally, was people. It is always people first, isn't it? Some other hunters, I thought, or some folks who'd packed into camp back here, though it was an awfully long way in for that, and an awfully strange place to choose. But the longer I sat there and studied that thing in the growing gray light, the more that comfortable explanation fell apart in my hands. Because of the sheer size of those branches, those whole trees, that no 2 or 3 men could have wrestled into place. Because of where it stood, miles and miles from the nearest road. And because of that pattern, that strange, dense, purposeful pattern that no human being would ever trouble themselves to make. And there was something else, too, something that took my slow morning mind a long moment to put its finger on. There were no signs of people. None. No fire ring, blackened with old ashes. No scraps of trash, no foil, no cans, no bottles, the way people always leave behind them. No cut stumps where someone had taken a saw or an axe to gather the wood. No trampled down ground, no worn path leading up to it. Whoever, or whatever, had built that structure had dragged all that heavy timber in from somewhere else, and had raised it up, without ever once lighting a fire, without ever once leaving behind the small inevitable mess that human beings leave wherever they go. It simply sat there in the middle of my clearing, in the falling rain, this great wrong-woven thing, and I will tell you plainly that the longer I looked upon it, the less I liked it, and the colder I became, in a way that had nothing at all to do with the weather. I am not a fanciful man. I want to be very clear about that, before I go on. 35 years in the deep woods will burn whatever fancy you were born with clean out of you. I have heard every story there is to hear about these forests, every tale of the big hairy things that are supposed to walk them, every account of the strange lights and the strange sounds, and in all my long life I had never once given a single one of them a moment's serious thought. They were stories. Campfire foolishness. But sitting there against that snag in the gray and dripping light, looking down at that impossible structure, I felt the hair stand straight up on the back of my neck, truly stand up, for the first time in all my years in those woods. And then I noticed the smell. It came drifting down the ridge to me on the wet morning air, faint at first, and then stronger, and stronger still. A thick, rank, heavy, animal smell. Like a wet dog, but far worse than any dog, far heavier and far fouler, a deep musky reek that I had never once smelled in all my decades out there, and that I have thank God never smelled since. And I understood, in the way that you understand certain things in your body and your blood long before your slow mind can catch up and put words to them, that whatever had built that shelter was close. That it was, very probably, watching me at that very moment. That the smell, growing stronger on the wind, meant that it was near, and that it was coming nearer. I did not investigate. I would dearly love to tell you that I crept down the ridge like a brave man and looked inside that shelter to see what it held, but I would be lying to you, and besides, every single instinct I possessed, every ounce of woodcraft I had earned over 35 hard years, was screaming at me, in a cold flat voice that brooked no argument, to leave. Quietly. Now. And above all not to run, because to run is to tell a wild thing that you are prey, and to wake the chase in it. So I rose up slow and easy from against that snag, taking my time, making no sudden movement, and I shouldered my rifle, and I turned, and I began to walk back up the ridge the way I had come in the dark. And I did not hurry. God knows it cost me everything I had not to hurry. And the whole way, the entire long 2 miles back out toward my truck, I felt eyes upon me. I have hunted long enough, and been hunted enough, in my own small way, to know the precise difference between merely feeling spooked and being truly watched, and this was the second thing. This was being watched, and followed. Something came out of those woods with me. I never once saw it. But I heard it, a single time, a heavy, deliberate footfall off in the thick brush to my left, far too heavy for a deer, far too heavy for a man, keeping easy pace with me, and then nothing more. But it was there. It was alongside me the whole way down. And the smell came and went, on the shifting wind, the entire long walk out of those woods. I came out to my truck in the early gray afternoon, soaked clean through to the skin and shaking, though again, not from the cold. And I climbed in, and I drove home, and I did not go back. 35 years of hunting that one beloved piece of ground, and I have never once set foot in it again, not in all the long years since that wet October morning. I leased myself a new spot, 2 valleys over, good country, and I hunt there now, and have for years. And people ask me, now and again, the old-timers who knew my history, why I ever gave up my old country, the country I knew better than any man alive. And I tell them the elk moved on, that the herds shifted, which is a plain lie, and I know it for a lie even as I say it. Because the truth is that something moved in. Something built itself a house, in a pattern I could not read, out of trees I could not have lifted, in the middle of the woods I thought I owned. And it watched me sit there in its clearing in the rain. And then it let me walk out, alive, with that heavy patient tread keeping pace beside me the whole way. And I have understood, every single day since, that the letting go was a courtesy. A one-time courtesy, freely given. And I have never once been fool enough to go back into those woods and ask that old, patient, watchful thing for a second one. Story 2. From a hunter who knew his woods better than anyone, to a young couple who knew nothing at all about theirs. 2 people on a romantic weekend camping trip, deep in the Oregon Coast Range, far, far from the nearest trailhead, alone in a little tent in the falling rain. And the sound that came to them out of the dark in the middle of the night. The sound of something walking a slow and patient circle around their tent. Around, and around, and around, all the long night through. We were young, and we were in love, and we believed ourselves to be a very great deal more capable and woods-wise than we actually were, which is, I have come to think, exactly how most of these stories begin. My girlfriend and I had gotten ourselves into hiking and camping that summer, the way young couples sometimes do, all the new gear and the big plans, and we had done a few easy overnight trips on well-marked, well-traveled trails with plenty of other cheerful people around us, and we had decided, on the strength of that vast experience, that we were more than ready for something wilder. Something truly remote. So we picked out a spot deep in the Oregon Coast Range, down a long and rutted logging road and then a long hike and along a faint and overgrown trail, to a little clearing beside a creek that someone on the internet had described as beautiful, and pristine, and above all private. Private. We did so love the sound of that word. We were young enough, and foolish enough, to believe that being utterly and completely alone in the heart of a vast and ancient forest was a romantic thing, a wonderful thing, rather than the precise circumstance that every survival instinct your ancestors ever painfully developed is specifically designed to keep you well away from. The hike-in was a good deal longer and harder than we had bargained for, and it began to rain at about the halfway point, that soft, fine, relentless Coast Range rain that gets into everything, and by the time we finally reached the clearing in the late gray afternoon we were both tired, and soaked, and a little short-tempered with one another, the way you get when you're wet and your feet hurt and the romance has worn thin. But the clearing, I will grant, was beautiful, exactly as the stranger online had promised. A small flat patch of grass right on the bank of the creek, ringed all the way around by enormous, ancient, moss-hung trees, the forest rising up dark and dense and silent on every side of us, walling us in. We pitched our little tent on the grass, and we got our camp stove hissing away under the rain fly, and we ate a hot meal, and by the time full dark came down we had both cheered considerably, warm and dry and full inside our tent, listening to the chuckle of the creek and the patter of the rain on the nylon over our heads, feeling very pleased with ourselves indeed, and very far away from all the troubles of the world. Which we most certainly were. That was, of course, the entire problem. We were very, very far away from the world, and from any other living soul, and from any help at all. I do not know what time it was when I woke. Late. The deep, dead middle of the night. The rain had mostly stopped, only the occasional fat drip falling from the trees onto the tent, and the creek was still murmuring along in the dark, and it was black, the absolute and total black that you only ever find very far from any town, where there is no distant city glow on the horizon, no streetlight, no moon through the heavy clouds, no light at all anywhere in the world. And I lay there in that perfect darkness for a long moment, my heart already beating a little too fast, wondering what it was that had pulled me up out of sleep. And then I heard it. A footstep. Outside the tent. The soft, distinct, unmistakable crunch and press of a single foot coming down slowly onto the wet grass and fallen leaves, deliberate and unhurried, no more than 3 or 4 feet from where my head was lying on the thin pillow. My first thought, my desperate hopeful thought, was a deer. Animals wander through campsites in the night all the time, it is a perfectly ordinary thing, nothing in the world to be afraid of. So I lay dead still, and I listened, and I waited for the soft sounds to wander off. And there was another footstep. And then another. Slow. Evenly spaced. Patient. And as I lay there in the dark listening with my whole body, my hopeful thought about the deer slowly died in my chest, because I came to realize 2 separate things, one after the other, and each one worse than the last. The first thing I realized was that the footsteps were going around the tent. Not wandering past it, the way a grazing deer would pass through and move on, but moving in a slow, deliberate, purposeful circle, around the side of us, toward the back, the sound of it traveling steadily and evenly all the way around the place where we lay. And the second thing I realized, the thing that turned the very blood in my veins to cold creek water, was the rhythm of it. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. 2 feet. Only 2. It was walking upright. It was walking around our tent, slowly, patiently, deliberately, on 2 legs, in the pitch dark, in the rain. I reached over, very slowly, in the blackness, and I laid my hand on my girlfriend's arm, and I found, the instant I touched her, that she was already wide awake. She was lying there perfectly rigid and perfectly still beside me, and the moment my hand found her arm she seized hold of it and gripped it hard enough to hurt, and in that grip I understood that she had been lying there awake in the dark listening to it too, for who knows how long, neither one of us willing to be the first to move, or to speak, or to say the thing out loud and so make it real. So we did not speak. We did not say a single word. We simply lay there together in the absolute dark, clinging to one another's hands, and we listened to the slow, patient, 2-legged footsteps go around, and around, and around our little tent. All the way around one way, and then a pause, and then back around the other way. And then around again. It never stopped. In all those black hours, it never once stopped. It never came any closer to the tent than that first circle. It never tried the zipper. It never spoke, or growled, or breathed that we could hear, or made any sound on this earth except those slow, deliberate, endlessly patient footsteps pressing down into the wet grass, circling, and circling, and circling, like something pacing the boundary of a thing it wanted very badly, but was, for reasons of its own, content to wait for. I have tried, in all the years since that night, to make this thing ordinary in my mind, to find the explanation that lets me sleep. A person, I tell myself. Some poor disturbed soul living wild out in those woods, some hermit gone strange in his solitude, circling our tent in the night to frighten us off his territory, or perhaps working up his nerve towards something far worse. And perhaps that is all it was. But I will tell you the one thing that has never, ever fit that comfortable explanation, the single detail that I have never in all these years been able to square away. It went on for hours. 4 hours. We lay there rigid and sleepless and barely breathing in the dark, and that slow, patient, tireless circling went on, and on, far, far longer than any human being would ever keep such a thing up, far longer than any human being could keep it up. No man paces a slow circle around a tent for 4 straight hours in the freezing rain, in the dead of night, without ever once pausing, without ever once tiring, without ever once changing the unhurried rhythm of his stride. It is not possible. A man would tire. A man would get cold. A man would lose his patience, or his nerve, or simply grow bored. But this did not tire, and did not cool, and did not lose its endless patience. Something walked a slow, perfect, deliberate circle around the two of us, all the night long, on 2 legs, in the cold and the rain, and it was perfectly content to do so, as though it had all the time in all the world, as though the circling itself, the patient claiming of the ground around us, was the entire and only point. The sky finally began, at long last, to go the faintest shade of gray toward the east, that first thin lightning of the world that tells you the longest night is finally, mercifully ending. And at some point during that slow gray coming of the dawn, the footsteps stopped. I cannot tell you the exact moment. There was no final step, no sound of something turning and walking away into the trees, no parting at all. There was simply, at some point, the slow dawning realization that I could no longer hear it. That the only sounds left in the world were the murmur of the creek, and the drip of the trees, and the ragged frightened breathing of the woman beside me. We waited a long time after that. We waited until the gray light had grown full and strong and golden, until the sun itself was well and truly up above the trees, before either of us dared to so much as touch the zipper of the tent. And when at last I worked up the courage to open it, and we crawled out into the wet bright morning, we found, trodden into the soft grass and the mud all the way around our tent, a track. A path. A complete and unbroken circle, worn down into the wet earth by hours upon hours of slow and patient walking, ringing our campsite entirely round. And here and there, pressed deep into the soft mud of that circle, were prints. Large ones. I am not going to tell you what they looked like. I know exactly how it would sound, and besides, the honest truth is that I have spent a great many years now trying very hard not to picture them, and I would rather not bring them back to mind tonight. I will only tell you this. They were not the prints of any animal that I could put a name to. And they were not the prints of a man in boots, or a man in anything at all. And they walked, those prints, in a slow and patient and perfect circle, all the way around the place where the two of us had lain and slept. We packed up that camp in about 4 minutes flat, stuffing everything into our packs with shaking hands. We did not speak one single word to each other the entire long hike back out of those woods. And we have done a great many fine things together in all the years since, my wife and I, a whole long good life of them. But we have never, ever, not even once, gone camping again. Story 3. Now we travel back in time, into the old days of these great forests, to the men who labored in them. A logging camp, deep, deep in the Oregon woods, many decades ago, where rough men lived for whole seasons at a stretch, felling the giant ancient trees by hand. And the story that one of those old loggers told, only at the very end of his long life, about the season his camp came to share the deep woods with something that did not want the great old trees to fall. My grandfather was a logger, back in the old days, the truly old days, when it was all still done with hand saws and double-bit axes and steam donkeys, when the camps were set way out in the deep backcountry and the men lived out there for the entire season, sleeping crowded in the bunkhouses, eating in the cook shack, cut clean off from the rest of the world for months on end. It was brutally hard, dangerous work, work that killed and maimed men regularly, and the men who chose to do it were hard men themselves, rough and practical and entirely unsentimental, not at all the sort to be given over to fancy or to fear. And my grandfather, near the very end of his own long life, when he had become a very old man and I was still a young one, told me a story about one particular season, deep in the Oregon woods, that he swore to me he had never told to another living soul in all the long years of his life. He told it to me quietly, sitting in his chair by the window, looking out at the gray rain falling over his yard, and he made me promise, before he began, that I would not laugh at him. And I did not laugh. I would never have laughed, because of the way that he told it, with a kind of quiet remembered dread in his old cracked voice that I had never once heard from that hard old man in all my life. So I will tell it to you now, as near as I can, the very way that he told it to me. He said the trouble began slowly, the way these things so often seem to. It was a camp set deep in the true old growth, the really big timber, the great trees that had stood 500 years and more, some of them, trees so wide at the base that 6 men joining hands could not reach around them. And the crews were felling them at a good steady clip, and for the first few weeks of the season everything was entirely ordinary and as it should be. But after those first weeks, he said, things began to go wrong around the camp in the nighttime. Small things, at the start. Tools began to go missing. Good tools, expensive ones, axes and saws and wedges, and they would turn up again days later far out in the woods, well away from where any man had been working, undamaged, but moved, carried off and set down carefully somewhere they had no earthly business being. The men naturally blamed one another at first, and then blamed thieves, but of course there were no thieves to blame, not out there, 100 hard miles from the nearest town. Then it was the animals that began to suffer. The camp kept mules and draft horses for the hauling work, strong steady beasts, and these animals began to spook badly in the night, screaming and rearing and pulling frantically at their picket lines, mad with terror at something out there in the dark that the men, search as they might with their lanterns held high, could never once find. A couple of the poor beasts hurt themselves badly in their panic, trying to break free and bolt off into the night. The men would go out in a body, with their lanterns and their rifles, and they would find nothing at all. Nothing. Just the great dark dripping trees, and the rain, and the whites of the terrified animals' rolling eyes, all of them staring fixedly out into the same patch of impenetrable black. And then, my grandfather said, his voice dropping low, came the nights of the sounds. He said that at night, out in the deep woods all around the camp, things began to call. Not owls, and not coyotes, and not elk, and not any other animal that the men knew the voice of, and these were men who had spent their whole lives in the woods and knew every sound that a forest could rightly make. He said the calls were like nothing he had ever heard in his life, before or since. Long, drawn-out, low calls, and far, far too loud, loud enough to carry for miles and miles through the dark dripping forest, rolling across the whole valley. And one call would come from off in one direction, and then, after a moment, it would be answered by another, from somewhere else entirely, far across the valley on the opposite ridge, as though great things were calling back and forth to one another over enormous distances, all the way around the camp, all through the long hours of the night. And the very worst of it, he said, the part that emptied the courage out of even the hardest men, was that sometimes one of those calls would come from very close indeed, from just beyond the last reach of the firelight, and for a word or two, just for a word or two, it would sound almost like a human voice. Like a man trying to speak, and not quite managing it. Like something that had perhaps heard human speech long ago, and was trying, and failing, to remember how it was done. The loggers, every hard man among them, took to sleeping with their lamps left burning all the night through, and their rifles laid close at hand, and after those calls began, not one single man among them, not even the bravest and the most foolhardy, would set one foot past the outer edge of the camp after dark. Not for any reason at all. Not for any wage. My grandfather said that the men of that camp came to believe, over that long strange season, that the deep woods simply did not want them there. And more than that. They came to believe that the great trees they were felling, the ancient ones, were not theirs to be cutting. That the things out there calling in the dark were somehow the keepers of that forest, its guardians, its old wardens, and that the men, with their saws and their axes and their steam donkeys, had trespassed into a place they had no right to be, and were taking, loudly and greedily, what was never offered to them. It sounds like nothing more than superstition, I know, frightened tired men in the dark working themselves up and telling each other tales. And perhaps in the end that is all it ever was. But my grandfather said that the foreman of that camp, a hard, cold, utterly practical man who believed in nothing at all that he could not hold in his two hands, finally made the decision to break the entire camp and move the whole great operation, mid-season, at enormous cost and difficulty, to a completely different valley, miles away. And he told me that on the very last night, the night they had finished packing everything up to leave at first light, the calls came one final time. From all around the camp at once. Dozens of them, it seemed, more than ever before, and closer than they had ever dared to come, right up at the edge of the dying firelight, all through that last long night. But they were different that night, my grandfather said. They did not sound angry, the way they had before. They sounded, he said, and here his old voice dropped so low I had to lean in close to catch it, they sounded glad. Glad that the men were finally going. Glad that it was over and done. And in the cold gray morning the men hiked out and left that valley behind them forever, and they moved over the mountains to the new valley, and they worked out the whole rest of the season there without a single strange or troubling thing ever happening again, and no man among them ever once spoke of that first valley, or of that long season, ever again, for the rest of their lives. My grandfather told me that he went on to work the woods for another 40 years after that one season, all over the great forests of the Pacific Northwest, a whole long lifetime in the timber, and that he never once, in all those 4 decades, had another experience even remotely like it. Not once. But he told me, too, that he never again felled a tree in true old growth, in the truly ancient timber, the great 500-year trees, without feeling something turn over uneasily, deep down in his chest. A sense, that never left him, that he was doing a thing he did not entirely have the right to do. That those oldest of trees belonged to something other than men, and that the something was old, and patient, and watchful, and that it did not ever forget. And he told me, at the very end, with the rain coming down outside his window, that if I should ever find myself deep in those old forests, alone among the truly ancient trees, and I should hear something call out in the dark, something that sounded almost, but not quite, like a human voice, I was to do one thing, and one thing only. I was to leave. Quietly, and respectfully, gathering my things without haste and without panic, and walking out the way I had come, and never once looking back over my shoulder. Because the woods, he said, the deep old woods, were not mine, and had never been mine. They had never once been ours, any of us. We were only ever allowed into them on sufferance, as guests on our very best behavior, and the rent on that welcome, he said, could be called due at any time at all, on any night, without any warning. And the only wise thing, the only safe thing, was to be always ready, and always willing, to go. Story 4. We turn now to a person whose whole job it was to watch over these vast woods, and to keep them and the world beyond them safe. A fire lookout, living entirely alone in a little tower perched atop a remote mountain, deep in the Oregon forest, with nothing at all around her for 50 miles in any direction but trees, and sky, and weather. The radio was her one single thread of connection to the rest of the human world. And one wild and rainy night, that radio brought her a voice. A friendly voice, calling from a place where there could not possibly be anyone at all to call. I spent 4 summers of my life working as a fire lookout in the deep Oregon backcountry, and I will tell you, It is a job that either suits a person right down to the very ground, or else it drives them clean and screaming out of their mind, and there is remarkably little middle ground to be found between those two fates. You live entirely alone in a tiny cabin with glass walls on all four sides, set at the top of a tall tower, which is itself set at the very top of a mountain, and your whole job, your only job, is to sit up there and watch the forest spread out below you for the first faint wisp of smoke, all day long, every single day, for the entire length of the fire season. The nearest road is many hours of hard hiking away. The nearest other living human being is a very, very long way off indeed, on another peak, or down at the distant ranger station. You are resupplied once every couple of weeks by someone packing in on foot or by mule, and other than those brief visits, it is just you, and the tower, and a few hundred square miles of unbroken forest rolling away below you in every direction as far as the eye can possibly see, and the great weather systems that come marching across it, and the radio. The radio is everything, up there. It is your single lifeline to the ranger station, to the other lonely lookouts on their own distant peaks, to the entire rest of the human race. You come to love that radio, in a way that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not done it. The crackling voices that come over it in the long evenings are your only company in all that vast and beautiful emptiness. And it suited me. It suited me down to the ground. I loved it, all 4 of those long solitary summers. I am a solitary person by my deepest nature, the kind who has always found other people a little exhausting and a little baffling, and there is nothing on this whole green earth, I have come to believe, quite so purely and perfectly beautiful as standing alone at the top of a fire tower and watching a great thunderstorm roll in toward you across 100 miles of forest, the lightning walking on legs of fire along the far ridges, or watching the sun come up and set the whole sleeping world below you ablaze with gold while you stand alone above it all, the only waking soul for 50 miles. I was never once lonely up there, not in any way that troubled me, and in all my first 2 summers and most of my third, I was never once frightened. The deep solitude was the entire point of the thing, for me. The whole reason I had come. But there was one night, late in my 3rd summer, that I have never since been able to explain to my own satisfaction, and that I find myself thinking about still, on rainy nights, all these years later. It was a wild and rainy night, which up on the tower is its own particular and unforgettable kind of experience. The rain and the wind come lashing at the glass on all 4 sides of you at once, and the whole tower sways and creaks just slightly in the heaviest gusts, a sensation you never quite get used to, and the lightning, when it comes, lights up the entire forest below in great silent stuttering flashes of blue-white. I was well used to all of it by then, in my 3rd summer. I had my oil lamp lit against the dark, and I was lying on my bunk reading a paperback novel, and the radio was on low in the background, the way I always kept it, the usual quiet comfortable chatter of the night net, the ranger station doing its evening check-ins with the lookouts, the other watchers on their distant peaks signing off one by one and saying their goodnights into the dark. And then, late, well after the net had gone quiet for the night, the radio crackled, and a voice came onto it, and it called my station. It called my lookout by its name, clear as anything through the hiss of the storm, and asked if I was there, and awake. It was a man's voice, and it was a voice that I did not recognize, which was strange in and of itself, because by my 3rd summer I knew every single voice on that radio net, every ranger, and every lookout and every relief worker for 50 miles in every direction, knew them by their voices the way you know old friends by their footsteps. But people do fill in, I told myself, and new people are hired on, so I keyed my own radio and I answered him, and I asked, in the friendly way of the net, who it was I had the pleasure of speaking with. And the voice gave me a name I had never heard before, and told me that he was a lookout, calling over from another tower, one of the peaks away to the north of my own. And so we fell to talking, the 2 of us, the easy, rambling, comfortable talk of two solitary people who find themselves awake and alone in the small hours of a wild night, glad of a voice to share it with. We talked about the storm, and the strangeness of the weather that year, and the long loneliness of the season, and the things you think about, up on a tower, with no one to talk to for weeks at a stretch. And he had a nice voice, that man. An easy voice, warm and unhurried and pleasant to listen to. And I was glad of his company, truly glad, on such a wild and lonely night. But as we talked on, something began, very slowly, to bother me. The way a single wrong note in a familiar song will bother you, will snag at the edge of your attention, before your conscious mind can quite work out what it is that's wrong. And then, all at once, it came to me, and I placed it, and the blood went cold in me. The tower he had said he was calling from, the peak away to the north of me, I knew that tower. I had been to it once, on a clear day, hiked over to it on one of my rare days of leave. And it had been decommissioned. Shut down. Taken out of service years before, the lookout pulled off it for good because the sightlines from that particular peak had never been good enough to justify the cost of staffing it. There was no one on that peak. There had not been a single soul stationed on that peak in many, many years. The little cabin up there stood empty, its windows boarded over, its door padlocked, the whole structure slowly sagging and rotting away into the mountainside, abandoned to the weather. There was no one up there to call me. There was no working radio up there to call me with. There was nothing on that dark northern peak at all but an empty, rotting, boarded-up box, and the wind, and the rain. I went very quiet. The novel had fallen forgotten onto my chest. And the voice, after a moment of that quiet, asked me, gently, whether I was still there. And I answered, very carefully, choosing my words, that I thought perhaps he must be mistaken about which tower he was calling from, because the one he had named, the northern peak, had been closed up and abandoned for years now. And there was a silence on the radio after I said that. A long, long silence, full of nothing but the hiss and crackle of the storm between us. And then the voice came back. And it had changed. The easy warmth, the pleasant friendliness, all of it had gone right out of it, like heat out of a stone. And it said, very quietly, in a flat and hollow voice that was nothing at all like the voice I had been speaking with, that it was so cold up here. That it had been up here for such a very, very long time. That it got so lonely, in the dark, on the abandoned peak, with no one at all to talk to, season after season, year after year. And that it had been so very glad, so terribly, achingly glad, to finally have someone to talk to again, after all this time. And then it asked me. In that quiet, changed, hollow voice, it asked me if I would come up and visit. If I would climb down from my own tower, and make my way north through the storm, and come up to the tower on the abandoned peak, and keep it company for a while. Because it had been so alone, it said. For such a long, long, long time. I turned off the radio. I simply reached out, with a hand that was not entirely steady, and I switched it off, and the little glass room fell silent except for the storm. And I sat there, alone, at the top of my tower, with the wind and the rain lashing at the glass on every side and the lightning flickering far out over the dark and endless forest, and my heart beating hard and slow in my chest, and I did not turn that radio back on again for the whole rest of that long night. In the clean and quiet morning, after the storm had blown itself out and the sun had come up gentle and golden over a steaming, dripping, washed-clean world, I got on the radio to the ranger station, and as casually as I could possibly manage it, I asked them about the old tower on the northern peak. Whether anyone had been up there recently. Whether it had perhaps been quietly reactivated, restaffed, without my hearing about it. And the ranger on the other end laughed, a comfortable daytime laugh, and said no, of course not, good heavens no, nobody had set foot up on that old peak in years, the place was a wreck, why on earth was I asking? And I said, oh, no reason, that I had just thought I'd seen a light up that way during the storm, the night before. And he said that that was impossible, that the place was boarded up tight and dark as a tomb, that I must have seen a reflection of the lightning, or been half dreaming. And I said, yes. Yes, I suppose that I must have been. And I let it go. I worked one more summer up on that tower after that night, my fourth and my last, and the radio gave me no further trouble in all that final season, and I have never once regretted my 4 summers as a lookout, not for a moment. They were among the best and truest summers of my life. But I will tell you this. In that last summer, and even now, all these long years later, I find that I cannot hear a friendly stranger's voice come over a radio late at night, on a wild and rainy night, without feeling that same old cold come creeping back into me. Because I think about that voice, sometimes, in the dark. So glad, it said, so very glad to finally have someone to talk to. So lonely, up there on the abandoned peak in the dark, for such a long, long time. And I think about how very close I came, on that one wild and rainy night, lulled by an easy warm voice and worn soft by the long weeks of solitude, to saying yes. To climbing down out of the safety of my own bright tower, and walking out into that storm, and making my way north through all those dark and streaming miles of forest, to keep it company. And I wonder, sometimes, late at night, what exactly would have been waiting for me, up there on that cold, dark, abandoned, boarded-up peak, in that empty rotting tower, if I had ever been foolish enough, and lonely enough, to go. Story 5. We come now to the loneliest stretch of road there is anywhere. A long-haul trucker, driving a remote mountain highway through the Oregon forests in the dead and rainy heart of the night, through mile after mile after mile of empty, dripping, sleeping wilderness. And the hitchhiker that he saw, standing alone at the side of that road, in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain, where no living person could possibly have been. I drove long-haul trucks for the better part of 20 years, all over this whole wide country, but the routes that I remember the best, the ones that have truly stayed with me down through the years, are the long night runs through the deep mountain forests of the Pacific Northwest. There is nothing else in all my years of driving quite like them. You are alone in the cab of your truck, just you and the long reach of your headlights and the low murmur of the radio for company, and the road winds on for hour after hour after hour through these vast, dark, ancient forests, climbing up over the high mountain passes and then dropping down into the deep black valleys, and for long, long stretches of it, there is simply nothing at all. No towns. No houses. No lights of any kind. No other vehicles sharing the road with you. Just the great trees crowding in close and dark on both sides of the narrow highway, and the white center line unspooling endlessly out of the dark into your headlights, and, on a wet night, the rain coming down so hard and so heavy that the wipers can barely sweep it away fast enough to see. It is beautiful, in its own stark and lonely way, those night runs. And it is lonely in a way that gets down deep into your bones and stays there, just you, awake and warm and moving, a single small point of light and life sliding through all that vast, dark, sleeping, watchful wilderness. This was a night exactly like that. A bad one, even by the standards of that country. The rain was just hammering straight down, coming over a high mountain pass on a particularly remote and lonely stretch of highway through the Oregon Cascades, somewhere around 2, perhaps 3 o'clock in the morning. I had not seen another vehicle, not so much as a pair of distant taillights, in well over an hour. I was deep down in that long-haul road trance that you fall into on the night runs, where half of your mind is locked onto the driving, the road and the rain and the rhythm of the wipers, and the other half has drifted off somewhere quiet and far away, the miles rolling by almost unnoticed beneath you, the dark trees sliding past and past and past. And then my headlights swept around a long curve and picked up something ahead, at the very edge of the road, and I came up on it fast, and as I did I saw what it was. It was a person. A figure, standing right at the edge of the pavement, in the pouring rain, with one arm held out, and the thumb up. A hitchhiker. Now, the first thing that you have to understand, to feel this the way I felt it, is just how deeply wrong that was. Where I was on that road, at that hour of that night, was nowhere at all. The nearest town in either direction was a solid hour of hard mountain driving away. There was no broken-down car pulled over anywhere that I had passed. There was no campground, no trailhead, no reason on God's green earth for a single human being to be standing out there at the side of that mountain highway, miles and miles from any other living thing, in the freezing pouring rain, at 3 o'clock in the morning. People do not walk that road. There is nowhere on it to walk to, and nowhere to walk from. And yet there he undeniably was, caught full in the white glare of my headlights for a second or two as I bore down on him, a figure in dark, soaked clothing, one arm out, thumb up, standing very still and very straight at the edge of the trees. I am not, as a rule, in the habit of picking up hitchhikers, and I can promise you I was not about to break that rule for the first time at 3 in the morning in the dead middle of nowhere, so I did not slow down. But as I swept past him, in the brief second or two that my lights washed full across him, I got a clear look at his face. And I have spent a great many years since that night trying to forget that face, and I never once have, not for a single day. Because he was smiling. Standing there, all alone, in the freezing rain, in the middle of the dark and endless forest, at 3 o'clock in the morning, with the glare of my headlights full upon him, he was smiling at me. A wide, fixed, knowing smile. A smile that did not belong, not in any way, on the face of some poor stranded traveler grateful at the sight of an approaching truck. It was a smile that said, somehow, that he had been expecting me. A smile that said he knew something that I did not. And his eyes, caught in the headlights, shone. They caught the light and threw it back, a flat, bright, silver reflective shine, the way an animal's eyes shine back at you out of the dark at the edge of your campfire. The way no human eye has ever shown. I saw that smiling face, with its two flat shining eyes, for the space of a single second, and then I was past him and he was gone behind me in the dark, and I will tell you, every single hair on my entire body stood straight up on end, and without even deciding to, I pressed my foot down harder on the accelerator, and I did not look in my mirror. I did not dare to look in my mirror. But here is the thing. Here is the thing that I have never, in all the years since, been able to get past, or to explain, or to forget. About a mile up the road, perhaps 2, my headlights swept around another curve and picked up a figure at the side of the road again. One arm out. Thumb up. Standing at the very edge of the trees in the pouring rain. And as I came up on it, my stomach dropping away inside me, I told myself, desperately, that it had to be a different person, that it simply had to be, that there must be 2 of them out here, a pair, that was all, that was the explanation. And then my lights washed across his face. And it was him. The very same man. The same dark, soaking clothes. The same wide, fixed, knowing smile. The same 2 flat, silver, shining eyes. Standing there at the side of the road a mile or 2 further on a road that I had been driving at 60 miles an hour, a winding mountain road with no side roads branching off it, no shortcuts, no possible way on this earth for any man on foot to have gotten ahead of a speeding truck. Smiling at me. Waiting for me. As if to say, going somewhere, friend. As if to say, you cannot outrun me. Not out here. Not on my own road. I did not stop. I want to be very, very clear with you about that. I did not even let the thought of stopping enter my mind. I drove. I drove faster than I had any business driving on a wet and winding mountain road in the black of night, faster than was anything like safe, both hands locked white-knuckled on the wheel, my eyes fixed dead ahead, and I prayed, I actually found myself praying out loud in the cab, that I would not see that figure again. And a few miles further on, my headlights caught something pale ahead at the roadside, and my heart simply stopped dead in my chest, but it was only a mile marker, a little reflective sign standing in the weeds, nothing at all, and I let out a long shaking breath. And then I came around the very next bend in the road. And there he was. Standing at the side of the road. One arm out. Thumb up. That wide knowing smile. Those flat shining eyes. Waiting for me. I saw that hitchhiker 4 separate times that night, on a single empty stretch of mountain road where it was flatly, completely, utterly impossible for any walking man to keep appearing ahead of a truck doing 60 miles an hour. 4 times. And each time it was exactly the same. The same dark-soaked figure. The same wide, fixed, knowing smile. The same 2 flat, silver, shining eyes. Except for one thing. Each time, it seemed to me, he was standing just a little bit closer to the edge of the road than the time before. A little closer to my lane. A little closer to the truck. As though each time he expected, with just a little more confidence than the last, that this would surely be the time that I finally slowed, and stopped, and opened the door for him. I did not stop. The 4th time was the last. I came down at long last out of the high country, down the long grade toward the valley floor and the first far-off scattered lights of a sleeping town, real lights, electric lights, human lights, and as I came down out of the trees I did not see him again. He did not follow me down out of the woods. But I will tell you that I have driven a great many roads in the years since that night, in all kinds of weather and at all hours of the night, and there is one single thing that I will never, ever do again, as long as I live and breathe, no matter the circumstances, no matter how pitiful and stranded and desperate they may appear, no matter how badly they seem to need a stranger's help. On a dark and rainy night, on a lonely road through the deep woods, I will never, ever stop for someone standing at the side of the road. Because some of them, I know now, I know it for a certainty, are not stranded travelers, and are not lost, and are not waiting for a kindly ride to the next town. Some of them are simply waiting. They have all the patience in the world, and they are simply, endlessly, waiting. And the deep woods, I have learned, are full of patient things. Story 6. This next one is quieter than the others, and sadder, and stranger. It comes from a search and rescue volunteer, a man who spent many long years looking for the lost out in the Oregon wilderness, and who came, over all those years and all those searches, to understand something about that forest that he could never quite bring himself to say aloud to anyone. Something about the people who go into the deep woods, and never come out again, and about the strange in certain places where they are never, ever found. I volunteered with search and rescue in the Oregon backcountry for the better part of 15 years, and in all that time I helped to look for a great many lost and missing people. Hikers who had wandered off the trail and become turned around. Hunters who had gotten themselves badly lost chasing game up some unfamiliar ridge. Children, sometimes, and those are the ones that stay with you, that wake you in the night even now. Elderly folks, confused, who had simply walked off into the trees and kept on walking. And the plain truth of search and rescue work, the truth that we did not much like to dwell on, and certainly never discussed with the frightened waiting families, is this. You find most of them. You truly do. The great majority of lost people are found, one way or another, alive or otherwise, within a mile or two of the spot where they first went missing. Because lost people, it turns out, behave in fairly predictable ways. They follow the path of least resistance through the terrain. They tend to head downhill, because downhill is easier. They follow water, streams and creeks, because some deep instinct tells them water leads to people. And so, over the years, you learn to think the way a lost and frightened person thinks, to predict where their own panic and exhaustion will have carried them, and you go to those places, and you find them. Most of them. Most of the time. But not all of them. And it is the ones that you do not find, the ones you never find, that I want to tell you about tonight, because over those 15 long years, I slowly came to notice something about them. Something that I have never once been comfortable with, and that I have never in all my life had any good or sensible explanation for. There are people who go into those deep woods and who simply, utterly vanish. Not many. Thank God, not many. But some. And the ones who truly vanish, the ones we never find, despite everything, despite hundreds of trained searchers and tracking dogs and helicopters with heat-sensing cameras and weeks upon weeks of grinding grid searches covering every square foot of ground for miles, those few, they do not fit the pattern. They break it entirely. The lost people who behave like lost people, who go downhill and follow the water, those we find. The ones we never find are the ones who seem, from what little sign they leave, to have done the exact opposite of everything a lost person does. They go uphill. They climb, into the steepest and the worst and the most broken terrain there is. They head away from the water, away from the easy ground, away from the trails and the roads and any place at all where they might reasonably be found, and they push on, deeper and higher and farther, into the very densest, darkest, most impassable old-growth country there is. As though something were not driving them away in panic, but drawing them on. Drawing them up, and in, and away. Calling them, somehow, off the sensible path and up into the deep dark places where no one would ever think to look, and where no one would ever find them. I will tell you about one search in particular, because it is the one that finally broke something loose inside me, that changed the way I understood the work, and the woods, forever. We were looking for a man. An experienced hiker, fit, capable, well-equipped, who knew the backcountry and should by every measure have known exactly what to do if he became lost. He had gone missing in a stretch of deep, old, ancient forest, and we had been searching hard for days, and we had found absolutely nothing, which by itself was deeply strange for someone of his experience, who should have stayed put, or headed downhill, or followed the water, and been found. On about the 4th day of the search, I was working a grid line through a particularly dense and dark and ancient patch of old growth, the kind of place where the great canopy seals out the sky entirely and it is dim as deep dusk even at high noon, and the silence is total and absolute, no birdsong, no insects, no wind, nothing at all but the drip of water and the sound of your own breathing. And I came down into a little hollow among the great old trees. And I felt it, the very instant that I stepped down into that hollow. A wrongness. The hair stood straight up all along my arms and the back of my neck. The air itself felt heavy, and thick, and watchful, the way the air feels, I have always imagined, in certain very old churches, or on certain old and terrible battlefields where many men died. A feeling of presence. An overwhelming, undeniable feeling of being somewhere that I was not supposed to be. Somewhere that did not belong to me, or to any of us, or to anything human at all. I am not a superstitious man. I want you to understand that. 15 years of grim, hard, practical, often heartbreaking work in those woods does not leave very much room in a man for superstition. But I stood there in that silent green hollow among those ancient trees, and every animal instinct that I possessed was howling at me, in a cold and wordless voice, to get out. That this was a bad place. That this was a place that kept things. That this was a place that I must leave, at once, and never, ever return to. We never found that man. Not in that hollow where I could not bring myself to linger, and not anywhere else in all those miles of forest, though we searched for weeks. He was never found at all, that man, like a small handful of others over my years of searching. Simply gone. Swallowed whole by the forest, as though he had walked up to a door standing open in the empty air, and stepped through it, and closed it softly behind him. And I came to believe, slowly, over those 15 long years and all those searches, something that I have never once said aloud to another living soul, until this very night, because it is not the kind of thing that a sensible, practical, grown man is ever supposed to believe, let alone to say. I came to believe that there are places, deep in those old forests, that are not quite like other places. Thin places, an old friend of mine, who had felt the very same thing in his own years of searching, once called them, and the name has always stayed with me. Thin places. Places where the woods are older, and stranger, and somehow hungrier than all the forest around them. Places that have a kind of pull to them, a draw, a quiet terrible gravity, that reaches out and takes hold of certain lost and frightened and exhausted people and draws them up, and on, and in, off the sensible downhill path and away from the water and up into the deep dark broken country where they will never, ever be found. And I came to believe, in my deepest heart, that the people we never found were not lost in the ordinary way at all. I came to believe that the forest took them. That it reached out from one of its thin, old, hungry places, and called them in, and closed quietly over them, and kept them. Keeps them still. I retired from the search and rescue work a few years back now. My knees, mostly, and my back, the way the body always gives out long before the will to keep going does. And I am at peace with the great majority of the work that I did out there over those 15 years. We saved a great many people. We brought a great many frightened, lost, freezing, grateful souls back down out of those woods and home again to their weeping families, and that is a very good thing to have done with a portion of one's life, perhaps the best thing I ever did. But I will tell you what it is that I carry with me, still, the thing that I expect I will carry with me right to the very end of my own days. It is the thought of those few that we never found. Not lying somewhere out there that we simply overlooked, in the ordinary tragic way. But somewhere else. Somewhere in. Drawn up and away into one of those thin, old, hungry places among the most ancient of the trees, taken and kept by the forest, still there, in some sense that I cannot explain and do not wish to. And on rainy nights, when the rain comes down soft and steady on the roof above me the way it comes down out there in those deep woods, falling on a billion leaves, I think about them, out there in the dark and the wet, in the deep and secret places, kept. And I hope, though I have no earthly reason at all to hope it, that wherever it is the forest has taken them, they are somehow not afraid, and they are not cold, and that they are not, in the end, alone. Story 7. This is the last of our stories, and it is the oldest of them all, and the quietest, and I will tell it to you gently, because by now you may well be drifting, and that is exactly as it should be. This last one comes not from a hunter, or a camper, or a logger, or a lookout, or a driver, or a searcher, but from the people who were here in these woods first, long, long before any of the rest of us ever came. It is a story of the deep forest as it was always understood by those who knew it longest and best. And of the single oldest rule, the one rule that has never, in all the long ages, once changed. There was an old man that I knew, many years ago now, whose people had lived in and alongside the great Oregon forest since long, long before my own people ever came across the water to this country. Since time out of mind, as he used to say to me. Since before the counting of years. And he knew those deep woods, and the things that dwell within them, in a way that no map and no trail guide and no field manual could ever hope to teach, a deep knowledge passed down to him across more generations than he himself could number, handed down from a time when his people and the deep forest were not strangers to one another, and were not enemies, but were old, careful, watchful, respectful neighbors. And one evening, late in his long life, the two of us sitting out together on his porch and watching the gray rain come softly down over the dark distant line of the trees, he talked to me, for a long while, about the woods. And I have never in all the years since forgotten one word of what he said to me that evening. He said that we, the new people, the ones who had come to this land so much later, had got it all wrong about the forest. Almost everything wrong. He said that we thought of the deep woods as empty. As a thing without a mind or a soul, a mere resource to be measured and harvested and sold, or at best a pretty green place to go and visit on a fine weekend, miles of standing timber and pleasant scenery and nothing more, nothing watching, nothing aware. And he said that this single belief, was the most dangerous mistake that a person could ever possibly make in their life, because the deep woods were not empty, and had never once been empty, in all the long ages of the world. The deep forest, he told me, was old. Older by far than people. Older than memory. And it was awake, in its own vast and slow and green and patient way, and it was aware, deeply and fully aware, and it had its own people, its own true inhabitants, the ones who had always lived within it, since the very beginning, the ones that we new people sometimes caught fleeting glimpses of at the edges of our vision, and told frightened stories about around our fires, and gave foolish names to, and did not in the least understand. And those people, he said, the true and ancient people of the forest, were not evil, the way our frightened stories always made them out to be. They were not monsters, or demons, or beasts. They were simply older than us, and other than us, and wholly different from us, and the woods were theirs, and had always been theirs, since the very first morning of the world, and we, all of us, every last one of us, were only the visitors here. The newcomers. The guests, at best, and the trespassers, at worst, whether we ever knew it or not. And he told me that his people, over all those countless long generations of living alongside the deep forest, had learned how to dwell beside it, and beside its ancient true inhabitants, in peace and in safety. And that the whole of that hard-won knowledge, all of it, everything his people had learned across all those thousands of years, could in the end be gathered up and reduced down to a single simple word. Respect. That was all. That was the whole of it. You went into the woods with respect in your heart. You took from it only what you truly needed, and no more, and you gave honest thanks for it, and you did not waste, and you did not boast, and you did not go carelessly poking and prying into places that were not yours to enter, and above all you did not take what had not been freely offered to you. And above everything else, he said, above every other part of it, when the forest told you that it was time for you to leave, you left. At once. Without argument. The woods would tell you, he said. They always told you, if you only knew how to listen. That cold feeling that comes creeping up the back of your neck, that sudden and total certainty that you are no longer alone, that you are no longer welcome here, that you must go, now, this instant, that feeling, he said, is not your imagination, and it is not your nerves, and it is not the simple fear of the dark. That feeling is the forest itself, or its ancient people, speaking to you, in the only language that can still pass between our two kinds. And the new people, he said to me, very sadly, shaking his old head, the new people had almost entirely forgotten how to listen for it. We had decided, in our great cleverness, that the feeling was nothing at all. Just nerves. Just superstition. Just the foolish old animal brain playing its tricks on us in the dark. And so we ignored it. We pushed on past it. We went where we were not welcome, and we took what was not offered to us, and we boasted, and we wasted, and every so often, here and there, down through the long years, one of us went into the deep woods and did not come home again. And the rest of us never once understood the reason why. He told me that he himself had been deep into those old woods a great many times over the long course of his life, and that he had never once been harmed in them, and never once even been truly frightened in them, because he knew the old rule, the single simple rule, and because he kept it, always, without fail. He went into the woods with respect. And when the woods told him, in that old wordless language, that it was time for him to go, he went, immediately, without argument and without hesitation and without ever once needing to know the reason why. And he said that the forest, in its turn, in exchange for that respect, had always let him pass through it safely, and had let him come home again every time, and had over the years shown him beautiful things, wonderful things, things that he would not describe to me, things that were not meant for our new kind of telling, and that he would carry in silence to his grave. The forest, he told me, was not our enemy. It never had been, not once, in all the long ages. It only asked one single thing of us, the one thing that we seemed, of all things, the very least able to give it. It asked us to remember that it was not ours. To remember that we were only ever guests within it. To go gently, and gratefully, and humbly. And to leave, at once and without complaint, whenever we were asked to. And so, he said to me, that evening on the porch with the rain coming down, if I should ever in my life find myself deep in those old woods, far from the road and the trail, among the great and ancient trees, with the soft rain falling down through the high green canopy and the grey fog moving slow between the dark and dripping trunks, I should be sure to remember three things, and to hold them close. I should remember, first, that I was a guest, in a house far, far older than my own kind. I should remember, second, to take nothing that was not given, and to waste nothing, and to boast of nothing, and to go through it all quietly, with a grateful and a humble heart. And third, and most important of all, if ever I should feel that old cold feeling come creeping over me, that sudden and certain knowledge that I was being watched, that I had wandered somewhere I ought not to be, that it was time, now, to go, I should not argue with it, and I should not stop to be afraid of it, and above all I should not go looking for the source of it. I should simply turn, quietly, and thank the woods, in my heart, for having let me come into them at all. And then I should walk out, the very way that I had come in, gently, and without any haste, and without ever once, not even one single time, looking back over my shoulder. And the forest, he promised me, the old forest, would let me go. It always had. It always would, for those who still remembered how to listen, and how to show respect. The woods were not cruel, he told me. They were not hungry, not for those who came correctly. They only wanted, after all these long ages, to be remembered for what they truly were. Older than us. Aware of us. And never, ever, in all the turning of the world, ours. He is gone now, the old man, these many long years gone. But I have kept his rule, faithfully, every single time that I have gone into the deep woods since that evening on his porch, and the woods have always, every time, let me pass through them in peace, and have always let me come safely home again. And I pass that old rule on to you now, freely, in case you should ever find that you have need of it, lying there as you are, warm and safe and dry and very nearly asleep, with the soft rain coming down. The forest is not empty. It is old, and it is aware, and it is not ours, and it never was. Go gently within it. Take nothing that is not freely given to you. And when it asks you to leave, my friends, however softly and however gently it should ask, no matter how much of you longs to stay among the great trees, you leave. You give your thanks, quietly, in your heart, and you turn, and you go, and you do not look back. And it will let you come home again. It always has. It always will, for those who still remember how to listen. And now, the rain is still falling, the way that it falls out there in those great and ancient dark forests, soft and gray and endless, on a billion leaves, on the tall ferns and the fallen mossy logs and the deep green sweeps of moss, on the oldest of the trees, the ones that have stood since long before any of us were born, and that will go on standing, patient and aware, long after all of us are gone. There is something deeply peaceful in it, I have always thought, now that we are here, safe and warm and dry and very far away. The forest does not need us. It does not miss us when we go. It does not think of us at all. It simply goes on, out there in the dark and the falling rain, being old, and being patient, and being entirely and perfectly itself, whether there is anyone there to see it or not. So leave a light on, if you would like to. There is no shame at all in it. And let the soft sound of the rain, falling on all those countless distant leaves, carry you down now, gently, all the way down, into sleep. You have no woods to walk tonight. No lonely road to drive, no high tower to keep, no lost soul to find out in the dark and the rain. You can lay all of it down now. You are a guest in no one's house tonight. You are home, and you are safe, and the door is locked, and the great old forest is very far away. Good night. Sleep well. And we will see you again, next time the lights go out.